Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series here on my second channel. And my guest for this one is going to be Christopher Knowles, who is a figure from the comics world, and I would say sort of adjacent to the, I don't even know if you call it conspiratainment world at this point in time. Who knows? At this point, the joke is it's almost become mainstream to have strange fringe ideas or to look into certain areas normal people haven't and then find out there's something to them. I actually want to start somewhere similar to there, Chris, which is a lot of people, if they know you from the comics world or the conspiracy world, will know your book, Our Gods Wear Spandex. I do want to get into some of that, but where I thought I would start was, I noticed on a lot of the podcasts you're on, where it seems like you're actually like friends with a lot of people who run a lot of the sort of conspiracy and occult podcasts, they don't actually often seem to ask you about your background much. They just sort of take it for granted you're like part of the furniture and they know you. And they maybe ask you a bit about your book or when you're working in the comics industry. But actually, when I was listening to a bunch of stuff, I just realized I haven't actually heard much about your own background in your life. And I did find one podcast where you talked a little bit about growing up in sort of like it's like a smaller town or something, right? Can you give me some what's the actual origin story? If this was a comic, what would the origin story of Christopher Knowles be?
Well, I think I've been on these shows so often that, I talked about my background a long time ago. So,
right.
It's a small community, I guess you would say. It's not the biggest network of podcasters and so on.
Sure.
But it could just be like I've just, like I said, I've been on these shows a lot. Let's see. I'm old as dirt. I'm 58 years old, Gen X. Old school, hardcore kid, punk rocker from Boston. Worked for Marvel for about 25 years as a freelancer. Retired from art just in time for the AI tidal wave.
Right.
To sweep it all away. But, Marvel's been gagging for air for quite some time now. I mean, the last thing I did for them was in 2020. And, we know what's happened since then.
Sure.
The whole franchise has just kind of collapsed under its own weight.
By the way, along those lines, then, let me just spin off that. What about this then? Since you actually did work like in the actual mainstream aspects of the industry as well, how was it taken within the comics industry that you wrote your book and you have this sort of dual identity where you go out there and talk about these potentially controversial things? Like, I know back in the 60s and 70s, obviously there was a lot of hippies and stuff in the comics industry, but in the modern day, are people not a bit more uptight? Do you never get in trouble for doing that? Or does it not get you sort of disapproving glances?
Well, the work I did was anonymous,
Right.
I didn't sign my name to it. The work I did was more on the merchandising and licensing end.
Right.
The group that I worked for was called Consumer Products, which doesn't exist anymore. I think that, since I was a freelancer and, essentially anonymous and also did work that was very difficult to do that not a lot of people out there can do. I think it was all tolerated,
Right.
The work I did was very specialized and highly technical.
One thing I found quite interesting, by the way, when you were talking a little bit about your background in this like smaller town, like you say, outside of Boston, one thing I thought there was two things immediately I thought of, which is one, I found myself that I come from a smaller town. Like I grew up in a town that maybe had like 10,000 people in or something. It wasn't a large place in England. And one of the things I found unusual is people might think it goes the other way and you come from the small town and you go to the big city and you're like, wow, everything is so different. But I actually think in some ways, coming from the smaller place, you almost get that microcosm effect where actually now, I noticed you were saying something similar about how like the Mafia's worked in your area, that you almost get a sense when you see it in a really small scale model, kind of how things are, how corruption and how power and things like that work in the bigger world. Would you say you had a similar experience?
Yeah, I did. I mean, first of all, I wasn't that small a town. So
right.
I just need to clarify that. It's a fairly large suburb and with a very large footprint too. It, geographically, it's pretty big. And it's just outside of Boston. So it's gotten very gentrified. When I was growing up, it was very working class, industrial, a lot of
Okay.
factories and so on. But also, as you mentioned, a lot of crime. Because of its location, because it's outside of Boston, but it's also all these major highways sort of find their hub in the town I
Oh,
grew up in,
right. Right.
which is called Braintree. So you had there's still a lot of human trafficking.
Oh, wow. Right.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, there was a prostitution ring that was being run out of the train station. And from what I was told, it involved like girls who were in their young teens.
Oh, wow. Right. It's just sort of an open secret. Right.
Yeah, and they would pick men up off the subway in Boston was called the T. So they'd pick men coming off the T, and they would take them across the street to this really dumpy motel that was called the Swiss Chalet at that point in time. It's since been torn down because it just became so overrun with crime.
Sure.
A lot of prostitution. So yeah, so like I said, you have this area that's at this confluence of all these major highways and train lines and this, that, and the other thing. So there was a lot of crime. The one thing that I've mentioned before is that the FBI back here was, I think in the early 2000s, they had this nationwide sweep of child prostitution. So they hit Denver and Houston and Chicago and then my town.
Right.
They hit all these major cities. And then, since this town I grew up in was such a hub for organized crime, that they also, and it was the usual kind of thing where like the cops were so corrupt that they'd always tip off.
Oh, right. I see.
Pimps and so on. But, I mean, there was a lot of crazy stuff, to be honest with you. A lot of bad craziness.
Along these lines, I tell you what, I'll spin it into this. One thing I quite enjoy about your perspective whenever I listen to you on podcasts is you're wading in there with some other people who are pretty deep into a lot of these topics. But I always feel like you have a kind of like I would say you have like a grounding element to your personality. It seems like you're able to sort of return to the mundane, and I don't imagine you as being someone who's the second the call ends, you're just off in a fantasy world. So one thing I would ask you, actually, I think this lines up with what we're talking about now, is one thing that I've noticed over the last, like, say, 10 years or so, is one of the big myths of I would say, like, the idea in movies of the journalist, who gets the information out there. Even just think of something like Soylent Green. The idea that if you just say the truth, and it's some shocking, terrifying truth, essentially saying the truth is like 90% of the battle they try to imply. Like, if you say it, everyone will understand, everyone will quickly realise the problem and, yada, 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 somehow it'll get fixed. I actually think along those topics, think about a topic like human trafficking. Mate, it's actually really disturbing to me how that goes from being scandalous in one moment to utterly mundane the next second, and everyone just acknowledges that, yeah, it's happening. And if you even think about things like the Epstein thing, it actually just sort of became a meme eventually, mate. Like, it's like people simultaneously are saying as part of the meme and reinforcing, yeah, this happens, it probably happens loads, it's probably going on all the time, even with really famous and powerful people. Lol, what can we do about it? Oh, well, change the channel. Like, what's the next topic? What would you say? What's your experience in that regard? Because I that's the sort of thing where if I was a boy, I would naively have assumed if a story like that broke, it would change everything. Everyone would have to rethink the way society was. It feels like everything, the beat just continues on, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think the rest of the world sort of caught up to what I grew up in.
Right.
There was a situation, I don't know if you've ever heard me talk about, there was a situation where there was this pedophile pimp who was working in the middle school that I was going to, and everybody knew about it. Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody knew that he had all these boys working for him, and he'd lavish them with, mini bikes and stereos and clothes and everything like that. Everybody knew what was going on. Parents would complain all the time because this guy was always creeping on kids and stuff, creeping on boys. And he was at it for 22 years before he got arrested. And it was another thing where he got tipped off and he disappeared on his 52-foot yacht. A middle school
Right,
teacher
as
in
they
the
do.
1970s could somehow afford a 52-foot yacht that he was arrested on off the coast of Florida. So, when you grow up in that kind of environment where things that are screwed up, but are tolerated, people just let it go. It changes the way you view the world. So, my grounding, I guess you would say, I think it just comes from a life of experiencing a lot of things and witnessing a lot of things that a lot of people might read about or hear about on the news and so on and so forth. But, like I said, this town was so infiltrated, so infested with organized crime, gambling rings, prostitution, drug rings, you name it. And so much of it was tolerated. Like I said, I mean, the story that I heard about the girls working the train station, I had got from a friend of mine whose neighbor was a cop, and he heard it from the cop.
Right.
And not so long ago, I think about 9 years or so ago, there was this huge thing where all this money and all these drugs and evidence and all these kind of things were disappearing from the evidence locker in the police station.
Right.
And this girl who was in my high school homeroom, was suddenly very suicidal about it. And, this girl was on the track team and had a family and so on and so forth. They made her the scapegoat. She, quote unquote, commits suicide. But eventually, all the police brass get caught up in it, and they're allowed to retire, allowed to quit, and so on.
Right.
But it was pretty well known that they were all involved in this. Because the other problem with it, when the evidence goes missing, that's when you have to drop these cases.
Right.
And because there's so much criminality going on that is all tied to organized crime and so on, it's just basically a lot of people who really should have been in prison.
Sure.
Were able to get off because the evidence went missing. One of them was somebody who tried to kidnap a kid from a store, after he got let off because of lack of evidence.
Right.
So the first thing he celebrates by trying to kidnap a little boy at a Bed Bath and Beyond. That was 3 blocks away from the police station, by the way. So I just grew up. There are a lot of other things too. There are things that I don't generally talk about in public, but things that I just came up against this wall, this wall of corruption and secrecy and so on from a very early age.
Well, I'll tell you how I could spin this then. I've got an angle for you, which is, I know in a lot of your work, obviously, like this is a Gordon White thing he's preoccupied with, is like Gnosticism and ideas like that. And one thing actually I would say is interesting is, when you think about these topics, it's just reminded me of a few other things I remember reading over the years. Like, for example, if you pick any big city, I think there was one where the example even was New York, like a really famous one. Even though you think of somewhere like New York and you think of all the films you've seen, by the way, that's actually going to be potentially a theme of this interview, obviously something that your work talks about, the idea that like we have expectations of what experiences are going to be like actually based on fiction. And if you think of movies, you'd think the reason why there's so much crime in somewhere like New York or Chicago you're just in Blade Runner. It's a million billion people. There's, it's people on top of each other. It's people in poor conditions. There's just a million people interacting, and eventually you're going to have a certain amount of crime. Whereas, as far as I can tell, when I've looked into these topics, it's actually the opposite, mate. It tends to be that an overwhelming amount of the sort of violent, really terrible crime is done by a very small amount of people. And the joke is the police have already arrested these people and know who they are, and they almost, they all have track records and they've been in and out of prison 5 times or whatever. And the number was crazy, man. I think it was something like 99% of the crime was done by, like a few hundred people, just some really unhinged people or people who just were career criminals almost, but at the bottom level of society. And so the reason I bring this up is that also seems like something I would almost tie into a metaphysical framework, which is, it seems like people are naive in thinking that like the authorities are trying to stop all crime and all terrible things around us. As far as I can tell, they almost like tacitly endorse it. If not, they're on the take as well. So what I would ask is, this is a really complicated way to ask this, is do you think in a mundane sense in life, there are like archonic forces that like want the world to be like that, want it to be corrupt, want there to be danger lurking around every corner or something? Is that a thing for you?
Yeah, I do believe that. It's a very complicated issue to address. I mean, there is metaphysical evil in the world, but there's also a more mundane type of corruption, and really what you're talking about, what we're talking about here, is more corrupt. Right. You know, it's people who go home and take their kids to baseball games and watch TV, but then they're all involved in these really screwed up rackets, drug rackets, prostitution rackets, whatever. And the other thing too is that if you've watched any of David Lynch films, Blue Velvet, it was very familiar to me. And actually,
oh right, you had that sense there was like the darkness lurking out there in the sort of idyllic, mundane world.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, one thing,
that's a great reference, brother. If anyone's seen that film, it's exactly what that film's like. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is that areas that are sort of dominated by organized crime, they tend to keep a leash on the street crime.
Right.
Just the regular type. They don't want the authorities poking around their rackets, so they try to keep the streets quiet. They try to keep things calm.
Right.
So they would, generally speaking, I mean, it was a safe place to grow up. Just, if you're just a normal person, there would be sort of these explosions of crime, particularly with younger people. But generally, the people running the rackets, one of whom was Whitey Bulger, who Johnny Depp had portrayed in the movie Black Mass.
Right.
He had actually killed one of his cronies right across the street from where me and my friends used to play basketball. And they dumped his body in the dumpster there. But they wanted an atmosphere where they could operate unhindered. And if there were a lot of street dealers or muggings, visible prostitution, the kind of visible crime that gets people's attention, organized crime elements tend to discourage that.
Right.
Let's just say. And so like the situation at the train station that I'd heard about back in 1982, by the way, it would have been very subtle. It would have been, you wouldn't have noticed. It wasn't like girls walking around in thongs or something,
right,
and see-through plastic raincoats. It was, from what I gather, from what I heard, the whole pitch would be like, like these innocent little schoolgirls who would just start up conversations with random businessmen until they found one that.
Oh, so there was like plausible deniability component built into it, right? I see what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said, the cops knew about it. I mean, the cops knew about all these things. You'd always hear. I mean, I got a newspapers.com account because I was really curious about all these stories that I'd heard about. And I wanted to read the news about them. And I couldn't believe just the vast amount of stories that I found out about this town. But it was always like, whenever there was some sort of prostitution ring, like couple people would go down, but the leader, the ringleader, and his best girls all got away. I mean, over and over and over and over again. So I mean, it's clearly the cops.
Yes.
And one story that I've talked about that you've probably heard me talk about is that there was this girl, who was in my high school class who murdered her brother in December of 1986, and then went on this spree that Quentin Tarantino would find
right,
too excessive. I mean, she's running around trying to project people. She's got a shotgun, gets into a Mexican standoff with the cops, and well, I mean, just one thing after another. I mean, she must have committed like 20 felonies in this, half-hour period, and the cops just said, "Oh, it was an accident," and let her off.
Okay.
And then several years later, 15 years ago now, she ends up shooting up a faculty room at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, which were all people involved. Just give you a sense of how scary this can get. People who are all involved in virology, microbiology.
Oh, right.
So she had clearly.
Are you under the impression this is like someone who was being used as like a programmed killer or something, or they were used as the fall guy for something like that?
There's no question in my
mind.
Right. There's no question in my mind. Because, I mean, even after she murders her brother, she's involved in all these other major crimes.
Right.
There's all these, I mean, all the way up to the FBI investigating her, and they always get sued off by someone. And actually, when she was investigated by the FBI, she was sending letter bombs to this professor at Harvard University, and then, like the Unabomber task force is involved in it, and the Justice Department sues them all off. I mean, FBI, ATF,
sure.
You name it, investigating these crimes. And then all of a sudden she gets placed in this college, which is right next to a NASA Redstone Arsenal, and the Marshall Space Center, which is all the paperclip people went. It's clear they were grooming her for something big, and I guess the something big was her gunning down all these microbiologists,
right,
in the run up to COVID and all that other nonsense.
Sure.
So I mean, this is the kind of environment I grew up in, and these kind of things were just, people all talked about it. People all knew what was going on. I mean, some really horrific crimes that everybody knew about, that everybody knew that there was some sort of involvement in. So, just as a roundabout way of answering your question, I mean, it's just like I grew up in this environment. I was dealing with this kind of thing since I was a kid. A lot of this stuff sort of impacted me and impacted people I knew personally.
Sure.
So it's not necessarily theoretical or entertainment for me.
Right.
It's very serious business. And a lot of what I do is just trying to figure out, like, what was I, what fetid waters was I swimming in as a young person?
Yes, true. Well, I mean, along these lines, I notice also you mentioned it earlier in your work, like you have a background in advertising. And one of the things I found very interesting about my own experiences looking into different weird rabbit holes and conspiracy things and the occult this is why, to me, one of the ultimate questions is there anything to the occult? Because if there is, it is the thing that ties everything else together. Whereas otherwise, these all just seem like weird, disparate counterculture topics. UFOs, is there Bigfoot? Is there fucking old civilizations that were lied to? If you have the occult, the reason that ties it all together to me is you sort of see the same things in every area once you have a versing in this symbology. And one thing I would say is people have many, many times before, whether you've read a Ramsey Dukes book or you've just seen famous documentaries about Edward Bernays, people have an idea that like there's these brilliant minds behind advertising and the manipulation of symbols. But it's not just, as far as I can tell, Christopher, it's not just some like, that's a bit like how in magic we would use certain correspondence. As far as I can tell, it just comes from that, mate. I mean, if you look into things like where NLP came from and hypnotism and things, these all come from the, like, essentially occult sciences. And I often tell people, to me, it's like the genius of modern technologies, as they call it, is it tends to just be like a secularized version of occult technology, as far as I can tell, where you get all the fire of it, but you just name it something else safe sounding, and you remove the backstory so no one knows it comes from. So I wondered, actually, if you have a background in advertising, you must already have been thinking about some of these thoughts about how things archetypally affect things in egregore, maybe even before you had a cult interest.
Yeah, absolutely. The occult's a very difficult topic to pull apart, though, because, I mean, there is what I call the Sorcererarchy. That there are groups of people who have these practices, sorcerous practices, basically, and use them to manipulate events and outcomes.
Okay.
But it doesn't work the way we're generally thought that it works. And it is more of a science. You know, you talked about people like Bernays and so on. It is more of a science than people would necessarily believe. There is a methodology at work. It isn't just hocus pocus and hope for the best. So, I mean, it is a very complex topic. And one of the things, if you're familiar with my work that I've been talking about for a long time, is all these basically mass occult rituals being held at, you know, football games and award ceremonies and so on and so forth. And this is all part of, you know, a sorceress mindset.
Yeah.
You know, that this is all being used for sorcerous ends. There is, you know, where does science end and sorcery begin, and where does sorcery begin and psychology end?
Yes.
I mean, it's very hard to pull all these things apart because it's basically just a question of whatever works.
Yeah.
You know, whatever works, and there's also a lot of experimentation and so on. It is a reality that more and more people are waking up to. I'm happy to say. I mean, I've been talking about it for a very long time now, since the earliest days of the blog. And I was kind of out there by myself for a long time. And then, you know, some other people came in and were sort of capitalizing on the work that I and others had done.
Sure.
That was, you know, that doesn't really concern me because, you know, I didn't see myself in competition with them. I mean, it would have been nice if, you know, I got a little more credit once in a while, but, you know, that's the way the world works. But it is a reality, but it's a very complex and layered and difficult reality, let's just say. I think a lot of people take a very simplistic view when they're looking at a lot of these things, and, you know, they'll see things that, quite frankly, are red herrings and don't necessarily apply to, you know, basically what I call spellcraft.
Yeah.
Being carried out.
I mean, put it this way, I am one of the people who subscribe to the idea that obviously everyone involved in the chain of doing these things isn't directly aware of this, but these things are clearly done to affect certain ends. I mean, that's why that term's perfect, culture. They're trying to affect culture and how we all see the world and think. I mean, I'll give you an example, mate. As soon as you were saying that about like the larger world spell, I could even give you a very simple, this happens every week in your country, which is if you're a foreigner and you watch an American football game, right? I was someone where I'd never watched one like as in live on the broadcast. I'd seen clips on YouTube, or I'd watch like some highlight footage, and it wasn't until I ever sat down and watched like a Super Bowl and I saw, wait a minute, so every week they have like jets fly over, they do the flag and the anthem, and then they have like even all the like chili. It's like this is just like this is almost like an Americana ritual. It's like we're trying to summon what people think of as like the 20th century America every time we have an American football game, and everyone who's there has that then set in their mind that this is who I am, this is who we are, this is what we represent as a culture. Here's all my, back in the day it would have been local people from your area. Like you can see, oh, that's like a kind of social ritual going on there, right?
It is, but what are the layers? Everything has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Because a lot of people will imitate things that they've seen. You know, what is the exact methodology at work is really what you have to look at. So what is this sort of a civic ritual, patriotic ritual, and so on? And what has a deeper and more troubling characteristic to it? And to determine these things, you really need to take them apart bit by bit and really get into the details, you know, really get into the weeds with this stuff. And I think a lot of people don't have the background to do so, and are also trained by a lot of, you know, bad information that they see on the internet.
Right.
And then sort of take it from there. And it doesn't do anyone any good, to be honest with you. I mean, it might feel emotionally satisfying to some people, But if you really want to counteract it, if you really want to expose it, since it is such an uphill battle, I mean, you're having to deal with people who just are going to resist you no matter what you say. You've got to have the facts right, and you've got to be consistent, and you have to be reasonable, and you also have to understand that you're dealing with people quite often who have absolutely no context for it.
Right.
So, this is why, to me, it's like, if you really want to talk about this kind of thing, this ritualism and the occult in public places and so on, you better know what you're talking about. And, not just like a little kit bag of a few buzzwords or a few stock explanations. You really have to understand it. Because, again, you're not trying to convince others like you. What you want to do is you want to convince people who are completely oblivious to it.
Yes.
Those are the people that you want to reach. You want to reach the people who have no context for it. So if you want to do that, you need to be calm, you need to be rational, you need to come across as a reasonable person. People are going to accuse you of being, tinfoil hat and all the other things, no matter what you say. You've got to just understand there are a lot of people who just like to be trolls, basically.
Sure.
But the more you know, and the more you can explain rationally and consistently, I think the better the effect you're going to have. Unfortunately, I mean, there isn't a huge margin in it.
Sure.
There's a lot more money to be made just telling scary stories and throwing around a few stock learned terms and so on. That's you're going to get people's attention. Doing the serious work is, as I've discovered, is a thankless task, but it's not. I could never be one of these hucksters, these people who just shine people on, because it's self-defeating, really. If you're not dealing with reality, if you're not talking about what is actually being presented to you, and you're able to pull that all apart and offer proof and evidence for your claims, you're not changing anything. You're just preaching to the converted. But I also think that you're creating this sort of backlash effect. People just get so tired of hearing all the nonsense and all the hysteria.
Oh, sure.
And even against their better judgment, they will resist, even the underlying message there. Even the underlying message that, there are weird people with weird agendas. I see it all as like just major OCD, These people are all, they're all mentally ill, really. And the occult really is just a very highly evolved form of OCD ritualism, to be honest with you. But, you're going to run into these brick walls no matter what you say do. But if you really care, I feel in a lot of ways that doing the work that I've done and the way I've done it for so long, has had an effect. I think a lot, if you're consistent and persistent, persistence, I think, is very important too. But if you're consistent and persistent, you're eventually going to break down that wall of knee-jerk resistance.
I mean, along those lines, I've got a good pivot for you, which is I actually feel like it wasn't just one of the reasons I was thinking of asking you to do this interview is I just noticed in the last few years, it feels like, even though I've seen you on all these shows for years and years and years and years, talking about every other topic under the sun and just sometimes talking about topical things going on elsewhere in the world, it feels like the last few years, people are suddenly ready to reappraise the concept of synchromysticism, mate, which was obviously one of your sort of OG fields. And I have to say, I'm in a similar position because I forget who said this, but there's some sort of saying that goes like, some things you have to hear like a million times, because it's like the millionth time you hear it is when it sort of sinks in or it clicks, And I have found that very much to be the case in life, music, literature. There's the people you don't always instantly vibe with. You get a sense of like, there's something about this I do like, or there is something there, but I can't grasp it. And I have to say, when I first encountered the synchromysticism stuff, mate, which I'm talking about like 20 years ago, man, I remember that guy, I know he's a friend of yours, Jake Cotsey, that guy from back in the day. And I remember watching one of his videos. I'm talking like when I was maybe, like 22, or I was quite young. I'd only seen a few conspiracy things back then. And I've got to tell you, back then, I just dismissed it. I was like, oh, this is really out there. Like, he's talking about the idea that like the same actor is being cast by different producers to sort of almost continue on an archetypal storyline through completely different films. And I have to say, back then, I would have done the really newbie sort of thing of like, well, that's not the way the industry works. And besides, like, how could someone decide what the script of the next movie would say? And that was written by a different person. I would have done all this sort of nuts and bolts. Like, that can't be, like, poo-pooing it away, as it were. But I have to say, the more and more over the years, I've sort of gotten a grounding in other areas that are complementary, as it were. It doesn't actually seem that crazy at all to me, Christopher, the idea that, like, within Hollywood, the people who get to decide who are and aren't in films might have a certain role they want someone to play, or represent a certain thing within the culture, as it were, and ideas like this. So what would you say to this? Do you agree? Do you think is the field coming back into vogue? Are people ready for it now? What do you think?
I don't know if people are ready for it now, but what you're describing is typecasting, really.
Yes.
Actors fulfilling particularly archetypal roles. I just did this whole thing on Winona Ryder. And if you look at all her early roles, it's very unsettling, because she plays either a child bride or, a very young person involved in a sexual relationship with an older man.
Right.
And this is consistent through the first decade, practically, of her career, particularly in her very earliest films. So why, what is it about her that would land, like, why did they do this? Why did they cast her? And then, you've got to understand, I mean, her godfather was Timothy Leary,
Sure.
who was an MK Ultra
Sure.
doctor. She was surrounded by a lot of kind of strange people involved in drugs and, psychedelic studies and so on. She was in an area that was notorious for child kidnappings and serial killers. So, once you start picking apart the details, and you can present them in an orderly and documented fashion, that's when you can really start to break down that knee-jerk resistance. But again, you really have to know what you're talking about. Particularly with a story like that. I couldn't believe some of the stuff that I was finding. And, this stuff is like hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
And so often the truth is hiding in plain sight. I mean, so it becomes so obvious and so in your face that people can't seem to recognize, what's right in front of them.
I'll give you a weird example. One thing you've probably seen is very much on in people's mind in the political sphere is when they notice. I'll give you a classic example everyone knows in modern culture, which is, the Netflix phenomenon, where the joke is if they made a movie about a polar bear, they would cast a black bear as the role, as the joke, because they just do this weird race swapping with all the original programming they make on these channels, etc. But what's weird about that to me, Christopher, is if you know anything about the conspiracy world, like, it was always implied they were doing things like that full spectrum across mass culture anyway. It's just they were less subtle about it in the past, they were more subtle rather, or they didn't make it so obvious, if you know what I mean. So, like, to me, that's another thing I feel like is a trend in modern conspiracy thinking, is people always think it's just like today that they've discovered the corruption, or today they've discovered something's being fucked with, or things are being implanted for us to see. But in a sense, to me, you're always just pulling on the thread, and the whole jump comes unraveled if you pull it off.
Well, as far as what you're talking about with like the race swapping and stuff, if you look at what's happened in Hollywood for the past, say, 20 years or so, all that kind of stuff that we see that people complain about really comes from like gay theater. Okay? It really comes from like the gay community, gay theater, all the, the gender swapping, race swapping, all these kind of things. So really what you had is that you had a lot of people coming into Hollywood from cultural studies programs, from theater,
Okay.
from all these kind of things that, quite frankly, are heavily gay. I mean, there's a heavy gay influence, and it became more and more pronounced. So I think that there's a lot of people who tend to get, sort of like racially conspiratorial about this stuff. And I'm not saying that there isn't that kind of aspect to it as well, but really what it is like gay theater kids, quite frankly, who like to just mix stuff up. They like to, what's the term they use? Subvert the narrative.
Right.
It's always about subversion. It's always about like twisting things around. But that comes from a particular culture, a particular cultural mindset, that I think, unfortunately, for Hollywood, came to dominate the conversation. And these people insinuated themselves in a lot of these companies and did so in a way that if you try to get rid of them, they would make your life very difficult.
Sure.
They're very organized, very insular, very incestuous groups of people that sort of moved in and took over large swaths. And it's a disaster, though. I mean, like I said, my phone stopped ringing from Marvel 5 years ago now. And everything that they've made ever since, for the most part, has underperformed very badly. And even if it's done well in the box office, has been a disaster as far as toy sales and merchandise and stuff, which is where the real gravy comes from. So all this kind of stuff that people love to complain about, and they should, has basically been, like, in sports terminology, like Hollywood's biggest own goal.
Right.
It's like they scored on their own goal. I mean, they thought they were putting one over and having all this fun and so on. And basically what they've done is they've destroyed themselves. And people go, "Oh, you don't understand. That's all, appearance's sake, and there's all this money." It's like, shut up. Don't even talk. Don't even talk about that stuff. That's not the way the world works. I think people are saying less and less of that now as the utter devastation, financial devastation of film and TV becomes more and more apparent. But I get very annoyed when people say, "Oh, well, they meant to do that." Like the whole fourth dimensional chess kind of thing, and all these kind of goalpost moving techniques that bad conspiracy theorists use.
I mean, what you're essentially getting at is, if they actually wanted to influence culture with some of this stuff, they would actually want it to be really successful, a critically acclaimed film. It's just still have all their gunk behind the surface, right? They're essentially, like, they do want it to succeed. They want it to spread out there, right?
Well, the point of running a movie studio is to make as much money as you possibly can. I mean, when you really get down to it, the people signing the checks will put up with a lot of nonsense because, quite frankly, half of it they're oblivious to, and it just escapes their notice. But, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. The proof, what we've seen in the past couple of years in particular, after the writer's strike, whatever kind of social engineering agenda might be put forth, he's always going to run up to the brick wall of the bottom line. The bottom line is always the bottom line, no matter what you're talking about. Funny money and money laundering and all the rest of it, it always eventually runs out. It's not
Right.
It's not a perpetual source. It's going to stop somewhere, and the rubber's going to hit the road, and that's what we're seeing now. So a lot of the kind of things that you're talking about have been just absolute suicide for the film and TV business. And now AI is coming in and is going to completely eat their lunches. Oh, it's over, you know? It really is.
By the way, one thing I do want to ask, this will be my big question about our Gods Wear Spandex. I don't have a lot, but I have this one angle to ask, which is, when this book first came out, I remember people almost making it sound like it was like the comic book version of like Fraser's The Golden Bough. And it's the idea that you're going to compare all these comic characters with, the archetypal aspect, which you do a bit in the book. But one thing I want to ask you was this. One thing that's something I've been thinking about a lot the last few years is I went from being someone who thought of myself as like a punk kid who was like anti-authority. So of course I'm against religion. It's all nonsense. Obviously atheism's the only thing that makes sense. It's all just ways to trick people. And I've sort of come back around to ideas like religion and especially spirituality more from almost like a cultural perspective, which is that I actually do think whether or not people believe there's any sort of material reality to these things, to me, within the human mind, whatever that is, I almost describe it as it's almost like there are grooves carved into your brain or a circuit that I essentially say you just run the God program. Everyone has some kind of a religion, whether they know it or not. And then this isn't a very witty point. I think a lot of people have made this before. If you don't make your religion an actual religion, it will be sports or it'll be politics or it'll be anything. It could be Star Wars. You could pick a million things. So one of the things I want to ask about was, do you have some similar thinking along those lines as to why we would pick, for example, superheroes? And they kind of are our gods if you don't have a religion. I mean, I can tell you, when I wasn't religious, it's a lot easier to identify with Superman than it would have been with Jesus at the time.
Yeah, well, the thing is that the gods, as we understand them from the ancient world, there's a lot of different explanations, but there's this whole way of thinking that Zeus or Hercules or Dionysus or Osiris, whomever you want to name, were all based on like old kings who became mythologized after their death. And it just sort of grew up in this whole kind of system, right?
Okay.
Now, when I had written Our Gods Wear Spandex, I did try to show that these were all working on, a very small handful of archetypes. That fit certain needs. So there was the Apollo characters like Superman, who are savior figures, who are going to save you, right? And then there are what I called golem figures like Batman, who are motivated by revenge. And then you have like wizards, wizard characters who can fall on a number of different archetypes as far as their roles, but they do so magically, right? And then there's the Amazon, which is basically just a male figure in drag. Wonder Woman is a male figure. I mean, all these superheroine figures, particularly from the earlier days of the business, are all just men in drag. And then you have, the team, the Knights of the Round Table, or
right,
whomever. This whole mythology of this super team. So, but what these things all did, and I think why the superheroes really came back in the wake of 9/11 and then the financial crisis, is that they offered people sort of a tangible sense of relief that somebody's going to at least address your problems, if not solve them, that somebody cares about you enough to fix things, fix the world for you, and so on. So, I mean, these are all basic, very fundamental human motivations that go back to our earliest days, because really what it becomes is that these figures, these superhero figures, are sort of like super parents. And we've all become children in the face of all these global powers.
Okay.
That, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, that's really what I try to do. But, the other thing that I try to do is like, so how did we go from traditional religions to this whole superhero thing? And then what you really had is that you had this sort of medium, you had the sort of midwife of the occult groups, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Golden Dawn. You had this whole explosion of occultist thinking and groups and so on in the 19th century, particularly with the wake of the Civil War, which had really given rise to spiritualism, because so many people lost loved ones, brothers, fathers, whatever, in that war, that they were so desperate to hear from them.
Right.
Because back then, you'd be sent, you'd be drafted, and it could be years before you would hear back what happened to your loved one. And then it turns out, oh, they died, in some battlefield in the middle of, in a place that you have absolutely no concept of. So it was all, the whole process was very mysterious. And I think that also fed into spiritualism. Spiritualism in turn feeds into theosophy, and theosophy gives rise to the early New Age movement in the 20th century and everything like that. So all these things are all playing a part in the popularization of the superheroes. And I really wanted people to understand that. It wasn't just like, oh, look at these cute, colorful characters. Aren't they charming and fun? Let's completely remake the culture around them like we did in, say, 2008 to 2020, this 12-year period where like superhero movies dominated everything else and sort of in some ways sucked the oxygen out of all the other genres, really. I think that also played into the ultimate collapse of Hollywood. But, the point that I'm trying to make here is that these figures address very basic human desires and needs, which is why they became so popular. We had lost, this religious faith that, they said things like evolution and technology and science is sort of done away with. And it creates this vacuum, because even if people's need for organized religion is quashed or suppressed, people still have the same needs, the same
sure. Yeah.
personal needs for safety and comfort and protection and all these kind of things that the superheroes ultimately address. But what I also think the really negative aspect of it, because it wasn't just superheroes and movies and so on, we also saw the rise of cosplay and LARPing, which had sort of been around before that with like the whole vampire thing in the early 2000s.
Oh, sure.
But it really distorted and I think melted people's senses of self, that you'd go watch these movies and all these powers and everything are sort of being dangled in front of you, and you want these things because they feel so real. You're in that theater and you just
sure.
You feel these characters, and that again gave rise to the LARPing and the cosplay, which I think had a tremendous distorting effect, and gave rise to a lot of more negative things, negative social consequences towards the end of the superhero age that we're still dealing with today. So,
by the way, along those lines,
pretending you can be something that you're not, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there's this whole worldview of people, just because I say that I can be this thing that I'm not, you have to accept it. And that, to me, comes from cosplay and LARPing.
No, I agree. I think it's the sickness of our age. I was going to ask, there's another area in which it must be interesting how, I mean, look, the good news is this: it means you were ahead of your time. The bad news is if you're ahead of your time, you have to wait for everyone else to catch up. So another area where I feel like this book must almost be getting reappraised now is, mate, when you wrote this book, people have to remember, like, the first Iron Man film wasn't out. There hadn't been The Dark Knight and all these massive blockbusters. Like, I always tell people the weirdest thing about my life as someone who loved comics and sci-fi stuff growing up is there's a time period, funnily enough, about the time this book comes out, where until that, it's like you used to wait so desperately to see a character you liked made into a film or a TV. Mate, I used to watch all of them. I've watched all the bad ones in the 90s, at that crap Fantastic Four one, where the graphics now are all laughable if people go low. Back then, you were so desperate to watch anything. It's like you were starving, whereas I feel like in the last 20 years, mate, I might not even have watched 20% of the superhero movies. Now they're everywhere. Like, they became ubiquitous to the point where, as you're saying, they almost became what film is now. Film's almost like reboots and franchises from video games and comics, and and then on the side they do a few original series. That's about it. Like, it's almost like the whole world's become comics. I also feel like what you were talking about in that book might have been a bit more niche 15 years ago or 20 years ago, but I mean, in some ways now the whole thing's scaled up. What do you think about that?
Well, a lot of it is corporate greed, quite frankly. This is going to work. Well, let's just keep doing it, and it's gotten worse because of all the other genres sort of falling away. I mean, I don't know how old you are, but I remember back in like the 80s and 90s, like science fiction film was the big thing.
Sure, yeah.
And, the superheroes sort of displaced that. But it goes back forever. Oh, this works. Oh, Superman's popular. This new comic book character called Superman's popular. Well, let's imitate him as often as we can. It's imitation, and but it is corporate exploitation. Keeping a lot of these things going. For instance, Star Trek. How many more Star Treks? There's already been about 5 TV series and 10 movies and so on. Tons of books. I mean, this whole culture. Why do we need more Star Trek? How does Star Trek speak to us?
Sure.
It doesn't. How does Star Wars speak to us? It doesn't. Why are they trying to launch all these series? Greed gets the better of these people, because all they care about is just goosing up the bottom line just to get them through the quarter. They don't care about the long-term implications of it. But, like you were saying, I mean, it just got to be like, I stopped going. I used to get invited, since I was working for Marvel, I used to get invited to these premieres in New York at the Ziegfeld, so I'd go see all these movies as they were coming. And it was a big deal. Like, it was a big party that Marvel would throw for all its employees and so on. But I stopped going ages ago because I just got completely sick of the movies because it's so formulaic.
Sure.
Same beats same story beats over and over again. And, to be honest with you, I mean, I loved superheroes when I was a kid, but it's like when I got out of high school, kind of was the end of my interest in superheroes, I mean, I would read the occasional superhero comic just as long as it was like something meta, with some sort of spin on it. But I really didn't care about these characters anymore. I had a lot of nostalgia for the comic books that I liked as a kid, but I wasn't going out and buying Iron Man or Black Panther comics or whatever. First of all, because I felt like since I read so many of those stories when I was a kid, like there was nothing new to say about these characters for me. But it's also like I'm not a child anymore, And I think there's an infantilization of the culture that superheroes and all these other things brought with them that is, very concerning to me. It's very concerning. I think video games play a part in this as well. Grown men, 40, 50-year-old men who have popular YouTube channels where all they do is talk about cartoons and toys and all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just, you know what I mean? It's just weird. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, like I'd be in high school reading a comic book and people were like, "You still read comic books? What are you, a baby?" You know what I'm saying?
Oh, it's weird that it's now considered the cool thing. I know, it's so bizarre.
Well, it's the infantilization of the culture. And I think a lot of it has to do with, it's hard to sit down and read a book. It's hard to find the time. People's attention spans are so shattered these days. There's a lot going on there. But the infantilization, I think, has had an extremely negative effect. I think that's collapsed the birth rates, marriage rates. Since everybody is sort of stuck in this adolescent mode.
Sure.
And not thinking about building a career and a family and a household. It's had a tremendously damaging effect. And that's before all the, it became just a venue for all the wokeness and all the rest of the nonsense.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's obviously the social engineering aspect, certainly. By the way, one thing I did want to ask you, it's something I've been thinking about whenever I've heard you talk about the occult or spiritual components, etc. And it goes like this. When you are someone who thinks about synchronicity and you think of it as like some sort of a coherent thread in the world of things that are connected, are you someone where, is it like an occult faculty to you? Like we have a sense that certain people have more than others or can be enhanced, or like a lens you can sort of zoom in on or something? Or is it to you actually some sort of like spirit contact? Is that why we sense that there are synchronicities or things that have extra special meaning to us specifically in that moment? What would you say?
Yeah, well, again, it's a case-by-case basis kind of thing. Algorithms are really screwing up that kind of work. When these algorithms are constantly reading your mind and shooting things back at you, this whole
because they're willfully
phenomenon.
doing it, right? I see what you mean. Instead of just coincidentally, right.
Yeah, and your phones are listening to you and everything like that.
Sure.
It's hard, man. You really got to take it on a case-by-case basis, because anybody who falls into this trap of like, oh, it's all this, it's all just algorithms and coincidence and statistics and so on, and then say, well, it's all just people who think, oh, the gods are speaking to me directly, which unfortunately a lot of people sort of fall into that trap when they get into synchronicity.
Right.
You've got to learn. You've got to learn to discern. Learn to discern. Learn to discern. I mean, telling the difference is going to probably end up being the difference between life and death for some people at some point. But everybody's got to learn for themselves. Really, you've got to. You get into synchronicity, you're going to fall into all the traps because they're inevitable. But if you're lucky and smart, you'll come out on the other end of it, and you'll be able to like, well, I can work with this now. I can do something with this now. I've learned to separate signal from noise. I've learned how this kind of thing really operates, so I'll be able to utilize it, quite frankly. I mean, and I've used synchronicity quite a bit, in major decisions and so on. Looking for a sign. I have these variables that I'm weighing here. What's the decisive factor here? And a lot of times that will boil down to a synchronicity that you really do see as a sign. I mean, I've had like really powerful synchronicities happen to me that changed the course of my life just because of those synchronicities. So it's a very powerful thing, and you need to learn to work with it. But again, you need to learn to separate signal from noise, or else you're done. You're doomed.
Along those lines, one thing I've always found has been quite interesting in my own journey is, and look, obviously, you just have to trust that I'm not talking nonsense when I say this, but I actually feel like I have an affinity to you in the sense that, like I say, it feels like you always are able to be grounded. And like my analogy would be, you could maybe have a magical or mystical experience, but it feels like you're still able to put your clothes on and go home at the end of the day without seeming crazy, mate, which I would say is it's obviously the sort of habitual problem of these areas, right? Which is, as you say, when people get into these topics, they do things like they tend to accelerate to the point of like, I'm literally being talked to by God, or here's a message everyone must have and you must listen to me, please, it's important, write this down, that sort of a thing. Whereas one thing I've appreciated is you've been able to go into these areas and you've certainly created a body of work about it. But I don't like, that's one thing I always find to be a red flag, mate, is when people are almost like breathlessly trying to like, you do believe me, right? And then this thing here, like, I don't ever get that for you. You seem like you always have quite, like, you're able to put a bit of distance between you and the topic. Does that make sense?
It's experience, quite frankly. It's doing it for a long time. Time and experience is the great grounder. Right? I mean, if you want to be grounded, just go through the mill over and over again. And I've raised a family, and I'm a homeowner, and I had a career, and I didn't have a lot of wiggle room to lose my fit.
Did you ever any times you came close? Did you ever have once or twice you were at the fringe, do you think?
I've had, I had some bad times. I've had some times where, I started to lose the plot, but there were always mitigating factors outside. There were always stressors, as they call it. There were always things going on in my life that were aggravating these things. But it's not, I want to be careful here though, because, a lot of people think, oh, you're disenchanted, you've lost the thrill. And it's like, that's not it at all. I wouldn't say that at all. I just, I've learned, to follow the things that are real rather than all the illusions. So, I mean, I still have tremendous, tremendous enthusiasm and tremendous joy for the work, depending on what I'm doing per se. But, I'm very, I'm more productive than I've ever been in some ways. I mean, I'm producing more work and got, a number of different blogs and stuff. And I'm going to be getting more into doing more video and so on. So I'm still like really engaged and I'm really excited, but just that sort of like that, I guess maybe that childlike sense of enthusiasm might have been tempered a bit by, the slog of it, by actually having to do the work makes a huge difference. And the thing that you find out with a lot of people, particularly synchronicity, is they simply don't do the work. They focus on a couple sort of key points or events or words or whatever have, just like a small set of variables, and they just bang them over and over again. And, if they don't exhaust themselves, which they inevitably do, they exhaust their audience. They exhaust everyone else. It just, you know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Everybody's dealt with it. Everybody's dealt with like, the think amateur who
of course
is trying to get you all excited about like some things that, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, synchronicity is a dime a dozen. Coincidences are a pound a penny, or a penny a pound. I mean, it's just, these things happen all the time. What we need to do is to, again, learn to discern what is significant. What is significant, what we need to pursue. And that takes a long time, quite frankly.
By the way, I saw as well that you had written a book about the X-Files. So I actually want to ask this, in light of what we talked about at the beginning, do you have some sort of like put it this way, to me, when I grew up in England, as you might be able to tell by my accent, to me, the X-Files may as well not even have been set in this world, mate. I mean, just the world of America to me was an alien place where the rules are different and people have guns and there's all crazy ideas that I've only seen through fiction, etc. I wanted to ask this, to you, was the X-Files some sort of like pure fantasy? I mean, I would say in the modern day, a lot of people would say concepts like psyops or limited hangouts. I mean, the more you look at it, the X-Files just seems like it's grounded within that. It's like to you, is it a work of fiction? Was some of it trying to sort of propagate these ideas into society? You can decide whether it's nefarious or whether it was to inform. What would your take on the X-Files be in 2025?
That's an excellent question. There are a lot of episodes that, quite frankly, are not science fiction.
Sure. Yes.
I still remember to this day watching the second episode, which was called Deep Throat, and it was all about test pilots flying UFO technology enhanced aircraft and then having their memories erased, through drugs and all these kind of things. And that whole episode scared the hell out of me, because it just seemed so plausible, the way it all unfolded. And there are other episodes like that, where like mind control themed episodes and so on that are not really science fiction.
But
then you have like liver you have like liver eaten mutants or
sure
whatever. You have the monsters of the week and so on. So it's a very complex issue with a lot of moving parts. And you also have to understand that there was just a basic need to just put something on TV every week. It wasn't like today where, you do the streaming and you can just take as much time as you want to do all your episodes and put them all up at once. I mean, back then it's like you had to put something on the air every week, whether you were ready or not. So a lot of it is just like, well, let's just do whatever, just so we can get this episode up, and we'll try to do better on the next one. So, yeah, I mean, the episode, The X-Files to me is, it's the prism through which I kind of see the world in some ways. I mean, so much of it I could relate to. So many like plot points and story ideas I could really relate to, because a lot of them just felt like, they're things that I experienced in my own life, so to speak. So, I mean, it's a big, complex issue. It's funny you should mention that, because before we spoke, I'm working on another X-Files book called XF Ultra.
Okay.
And I'm going to be going into all this. You're putting it more. That book that you're talking about, the complete X-Files, that was like an official book that was done for the studio, done for the production company, and so on. So it wasn't really like something where I'm just going to start going off and riffing. It was just.
But this is more in that vein.
So this book that I'm working on now is going to get really deep into all the weirdness and all the connections and the synchronicities and the real life consequences. Some of the stories. Got things like the lone gunman pilot with the World Trade Center.
Oh,
thing.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And I actually have a much different take on that. One thing that I've noticed, that a lot of people who talk about that episode never actually watched it. Like, they never actually watched the episode or listened to the dialogue. If you listen to the dialogue, it's like, whoa, this is pretty heavy, because the whole thing is like, yeah, the government's doing this because they want to create a new market for arms dealers and stuff.
Oh, right. Right. That's an interesting angle. Okay.
I mean, like, if you watch the actual episode, it's nothing, it's all just like incredibly dark and cynical take on it that I don't think a lot of people really picked up on, because they never watched it.
Sure.
But there's a lot of stuff like that. They got into a lot of trouble when they did those what they called the event series starting in 2016. The media just went off.
Oh, really?
Completely.
I mean, these are the ones everyone links the clips to now, where it's almost like predicting sort of like almost COVID type shit.
Yeah, and the media, the New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, Time. I mean, all these major media outlets were just going after Chris Carter like tooth and nail. I mean, just like attacking him and calling him all these names, and saying he was a closet Trumper and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, wow, right.
Yeah, it was pretty rough. They really, they were after his hide.
What do you think about that, by the way? That's actually an interesting thing I could ask you about. As someone who's been for so long tangential to the conspiracy world, which, as I say, used to be incredibly niche. I mean, the joke is, even in terms of the conspiracy world, there's so many podcasts now and people who have ebooks, and it seems like there's a million publication methods. A question I would have is this, which is one of the most bizarre phenomenons of my life, mate, is that ever since the dreaded cough and a certain orange man getting elected, bro, even the idea of being into conspiracies is now a partisan issue. Like, that's so bizarre to me, mate. I can tell you, when I grew up, and obviously a lot of the people I knew were left-wing at the time, there were a million left-wing conspiracies, mate, about the idea, they put CIA, put drugs in the ghetto, fucking arms dealing around the world, all sorts of things. In fact, back then it was more like if you were just on the fringes, you were into that whatever political dispute. How have they made it now? The psyop now is, if you're into conspiracies, like you said, you must be a weird right-wing Trump guy is almost the premise people just associate with that now. What do you think of that?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because, the whole conspiracy world that I came up in the 80s and 90s was very left-wing.
Sure.
It was, I guess it has to do with power, whoever grips the reins of power does not want their power questioned.
Right.
So maybe back in the 80s, it was Reagan and Thatcher. And then, the Clinton era and all these Tony Blair and all these disgusting people, don't want their nefarious activities to be questioned or analyzed or exposed. But you do see this in the X-Files too. A lot of these sort of figures like Lone Gunman and Max Fennig, these sort of conspiracy types. They're very countercultural because that was the milieu. The conspiracy world was very countercultural in the late 80s, early 90s, and sort of evolved. People like Alex Jones and everything that sort of arose. Bill Cooper throughout the 90s. And sort of did start to drag a lot of it right, even though there was always a very heavy right-wing conspiracy milieu going back forever. So it's one of these things that is a very complex and layered reality that you need to learn to pick apart. But I think a lot of people who you would sort of see as quote unquote normies were very, let's just say the term red pilled. A lot of people were red pilled by all this nonsense that started back in 2020.
Yeah. I think so,
and all the rest of it. A lot of people who I wouldn't expect, sort of, people I know who just seem like very conventional normie types with corporate jobs, were very heavily radicalized by that, just because it was so in your, the deception, and the manipulation was so obvious, was so blatant, was so upfront that only the most brainwashed zombies.
You can go the other way, right? If someone wasn't in some way changed by that, it makes you question that almost, right? Like, the people that just go along with business as usual, like, oh, well, that's over. They said it's all fine now, guys. Don't worry. In some ways, aspect it the other way. I'm more alarmed by people where nothing changed. Like, I kind of get what you're saying. A lot of people I know, that it depending on what dimension it was in, financial, medical, whatever, politics. I feel like that was a wake-up call for a lot of people.
It's one of these, like, turning points, like a crucible. And people are going to bend or they're going to break, And a lot of people know better, but go along anyway. And they obviously know better. And you can tell they know better.
Sure.
They go along with the crowd or with the agenda or with the government anyway because of fear. They're afraid not to. And with good reason. I mean, there can be tremendous consequences for people who step off the narrative train. Look at the cancel culture. I mean, all that stuff is really starting to wane now, but wokeness and cancel culture.
It was huge for a while, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, really, what that was all about, and don't let anybody else tell you different, was basically, the ruling class basically deputizing people who are severely damaged people to be their ideological enforcers.
Yes.
And that's really what that was about. It was just about keeping everybody pliant and submissive to the globalist, corporate, internationalist agenda. The agenda that was dominating most of the administrations dating back to Herbert Walker Bush, Bush the first, who's a huge globalist and a huge neocon and all this kind of thing. So really what this was about, it was just basically the old Red Guard from Mao's China.
Sure.
It wasn't quite as destructive and deadly, but it could have been. It could have been if people didn't stand up against it. If people didn't stand up against it and say, to hell with this, there would have been nothing stopping them, and we all would have been living basically, a soft-boiled version of Cambodia in the 1970s.
Sure. By the way, along those lines, actually, that's another thing I want to ask you is whenever I see all these podcasts you're on, right, one thing I find really jarring, mate, is, I mean, you asked how old I am. I'm 42 years old now, so I was a kid of the 80s. And I can tell you, when I grew up in England, one of the last vestiges of sort of counterculture was the end of people who called themselves punks, etc., mate. And the idea of people who were skinheads and they were into all outrageous stuff and ska music and stuff like that. And obviously, like you're talking about, then the hardcore scene came along and goths and people like that. And one thing I have to say I find really weird is all these groups by default typically tended to be left-wing groups of people. They're like anti-authoritarian or, fight the power and all that jazz. And one thing I find really weird, I want to know how you navigate this, is in the modern day, all of those people who are into the occult now, and that's their main thing, and that's kind of what they LARP as, and they're super into all this different, they might be into Thelema or chaos magic or whatever angle they've taken. What's weird is, even though they believe in these large, enormous ideas and potentially deep traditions and stuff, they all themselves seem to constantly be in the quagmire of like left-right politics, mate. I'm actually shocked by it. Like, mate, it actually shocked me to find there's like Thelemic cultures where they're trying to like cancel each other over like pronouns. And I want to just tell them like, bro, aren't you guys into Aleister Crowley's work for fuck's sake? Like, how are you going to cancel people over something? You know what I mean? What do you think on this?
That's what I'm saying. It's a LARP for them. It's
right.
cosplay. It's all.
Because do you not run into us all the time? People trying to snag you on things like that and think they can put you in a box?
People try, but I mean, I've been on the internet since the early '90s, so I've been in some flame wars. I'm a pretty hardened case, I have a pretty thick skin, and I see it all coming a mile away is another problem for them too. I know exactly when it's amazing how programmed people are. People just use the same catchphrases and so on and think that they're being clever. They're not. But yeah, I mean, I've talked about this quite a bit on X, like why are all these people who claim to be occultists or witches or Satanists or something, why are they just such, why are they all running around wearing face diapers and,
Yeah, exactly. You'd think they'd be the ultimate out there people, wouldn't you? Yeah, exactly.
Why they always fall in for the current thing, as they call it, always.
Yes.
They're all just weak, contemptible people. But to be honest with you, that's kind of, I have a very jaundiced view of the occult in general. Because I've studied the history of it, I've sort of come up against some people. For instance, I had interviewed Kenneth Anger.
Oh, wow, right.
Back in the early 2000s. And, he'd been living in like a flop house, but he was homeless because the guy was in his 80s and he's still doing meth. And
fucking hell,
had a meth freak out, and he tried to kill the woman who was working the desk at this flop house and everything. And I just was like, I remember I did this article for a magazine out of the UK called Classic Rock. It was actually the best-selling issue ever, by the way.
Okay.
And it was on Lucifer's Rising, which was a Kenneth Anger film that Tim Page had done the soundtrack for, and I interviewed Bobby Beausoleil and everything. But I just remember by the time I was done with this project, it's like any sort of mystique I might have had about the occult, whatever, just completely evaporated. I just realized just how grimy and sordid it all is. It's pathetic, to be honest with you. And I've also read a number of histories on the occult and everything, and like relatively celebrated, just completely messed their lives up. The occult just destroys your life. It really does.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are a few people who sort of LARP it. Jimmy Page, with his Crowley stuff, but it's like he made his money playing guitar and doing music.
Absolutely. Yes. And I notice he goes out his way not to really talk about that topic very much anyway, which is a bit conspicuous.
Yeah, which I don't blame him.
No.
But it's just gross. I've really, the more I see of it, and the more I see of like all this ritualism, I've just become like so disgusted with it all. To be honest with you, it just everything just seems so pathetic and grimy, and it really is just like people grasping. What it really boils down to is like people grasping for unfair advantage. When you really get
Right.
down to it, like I'm going to do this spell so I can get this job over this other person or whatever, or I'm going to curse them or hex them.
Actually, sounds like this could
kind
be tied to the concept of superheroes and the idea of them as a power fantasy in that sense.
Well, yeah, it is definitely a power fantasy trip. But there's a big difference between like, reading a bunch of comic books and going to a bunch of superhero movies and, killing small animals,
Sure.
using their blood in some sort of hex, that your rival in business or in love or whatever.
Sure.
It just gets to be. It always ends badly, to be honest with you. Anybody who has some sort of fascination or think there's some sort of mystique about the occult, there isn't. It's just gross. It's just gross. And whatever benefit you have eventually just it's drained away. Crowley's a great example. I mean, guy lost everything. Guy had like an inheritance. He was traveling the world and mountain climbing and playing chess. I mean, he had a lot of skills, and he just pissed it all away with all this occult nonsense, and he ends up dying. It's a guy who thought he was going to become a god,
Sure,
and start a church, and ends up like dying alone in some SRO house wherever, it was like Lemon. I don't even remember where it was where he died, but the stories are just over and over again. And like Jimmy Page, big rock star, but he had a pretty hard fall, and he had a lot of bad years with his heroin addiction and so on, and all this nasty negative stuff, which I sort of call collateral damage from the occult, happened to people around him. Robert Plant was in a terrible accident, loses a son. John Bonham dies. All these kind of things happen because when you start playing with these energies, which to me really are just death energies, I boil it down. It's like, are you moving towards a life energy or are you moving towards a death energy? And so much of the occult is like trying to manipulate death energy, right? And that's,
sure.
The blood and the animal sacrifice, sometimes human sacrifice, whatever. It's all like trying to manipulate death energy. And it's like death energy is going to overwhelm you eventually. And I really can't think of too many people who were really seriously into the occult or sorcery or what have you that didn't end up paying for it. That didn't end up paying a very terrible price for it.
Actually, along these lines, I'll tell you one thing we could do as like a last topic, which is actually, if I take quite literally in the term synchromysticism, the mystic part, I think one part that people have this is how everything's become like consumer culture, because there's this notion in the modern day that like anyone can be in the occult, or like it's for, it's just find the right flavor for you. Whereas I'd think of actually people who would have described themselves as mystics on like a religious or a spiritual level. That's a really unusual sort of person, mate. Like that is more like this sort of shamanistic type figure who would be, some sort of an outsider or who's willing to commit themselves to some strange life where maybe you do live off in a hut in the forest instead of among the people in the village, etc. I think one of the weirdest things is this notion that because you can write a book and put it on the internet, that like everyone should want to be into these things or that they should be of interest. Whereas one of the things we're really talking about here is I think they do. Well, first of all, they automatically do seem to draw people who are potentially mental or have like weird power complexes, etc. And then also, I think it's going to be a strange life if you get into these fields anyways. You've got to be someone who can handle it. What would you say on this topic? It feels like maybe people think it can be scaled up, but to me, maybe mystics are always supposed to be the strange people.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of if you do it right, it's its own reward.
Right.
If you're plugged in, you find how little you actually need. If you're really plugged in, you're not going to need all this ego aggrandizement that occultists seem to need, or you're not going to need all this material benefit. You find that you're content with very little. That once your basic needs are met, you don't need to pursue past that, because you're focused on really a kind of communion with these other energies, this higher force, this higher spiritual force, and which is the force of life, really. When you're focused on communing with these life energies, you find that a lot of the things that people tend to worry about or tend to need are really unnecessary. And sometimes worse than unnecessary, sometimes completely counterproductive.
Without the noble families of the Italian city-states, you may never have heard of or been able to appreciate the art of some of the greatest Renaissance artists of all time. And similarly, my content on this channel, which I consider art, is kindly supported by Abradiation and the rest of my Patreon supporters. Do you want to choose one of the topics that I might focus on next in a video? Maybe you want to ask me a question that I'll answer in a video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are for Thorinquiry. Maybe you want to take part in one of those private, never to be released, recorded for your benefit discussions with me one-on-one, where you can talk about almost any topic, assuming it's appropriate. Well, if any of those perks or others tickle your fancy, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today at the Patreon link in the description box below.